Hey guys, welcome back to Telltale. I'm Emily,
Great.
and we are going to be talking about women authors today. It is, as of today, it is March, which is Women's History Month.
Mm-hmm.
March 17th, actually, so it's St.
St.
Patrick's Day.
Patrick's Day. We got
So
corned beef and cabbage cooking upstairs.
we're going to eat after this, so we're excited. So I hope we don't cut this short, though, even though I'm hungry. Um, but we wanted to talk about women authors because there's a very rich history surrounding women in writing.
Mm.
Um, and there is some question about, I think, oppression and women having their own voice and having their own periodicals. And I think it's worth talking about, especially for Women's History Month, because even though we have a long way to go, we have come so far.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the first things I think that we wanted to talk about was the history of pseudonyms, women who
Okay.
use pseudonyms
Yeah.
in literature. And we kind of have a hot take on that. At least Greg does.
A little bit.
I have a lot of history where I know that there are a lot of female authors who were very well known who ended up having to use male pseudonyms in order to feel like they're getting published. And I think that's a very common thing that people talk about. But you have an interesting perspective.
Why I question if that's just perception or if it was reality because it let's take like the early days of novels.
Mm-hmm.
You had authors like George Sand
Mm-hmm.
that wrote as a man,
Mm-hmm.
and the what I hear is that they did that because that was the only way they could get published. But at the same time, you had Anne Radcliffe, Mary Shelley,
Mm-hmm.
Jane or Charlotte Bronte,
Mm-hmm.
Emily Bronte, um, Pride and Prejudice,
Jane Austen.
Jane Austen. Clearly, women. They got published. What was George Sand's problem?
Yeah. Well, what was the topic difference? I think there are some things that were probably socially acceptable for women to publish, and a lot of the stuff you mentioned were kind of romance-esque or daily female life
I
snapshot.
think that's the more important point to make is that women were expected to write certain types of
Mm-hmm.
books and they weren't accepted writing other types of books.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a valid assessment to make. But I also think when we start talking about that in women's history, especially in literary history, women are also humans having human experiences. Maybe it's different because biologically they experience things differently, but perception is still perception, and that's different by person, not by sexuality, not by gender, not by other things.
Hmm.
So I think there's this interesting separation between what is acceptable for women, what isn't. And so, especially in earlier days of writing and when women were just starting to have a voice at all, in print is especially. So I think it's a really good topic to still continue to question, like how much of this was for good reason? Like, was it for the good reason of getting the word out there? Did women really have to use these pseudonyms? And why were women considered only useful for writing certain topics? So there's still a level of oppression, if
Okay.
that's the perception socially. It also is interesting that women were still published under male names and they were still successful. But
Hmm.
would they have been if it had a female name attached to it originally? So there's still a lot of questions surrounding the whys. Why were women having to do these things? Or why did publishers make these decisions for marketing purposes? It's interesting to talk about. And we have to talk about authorship a little bit too in the context of commerce. What is sellable?
Hmm.
Because that's what publishers are looking for. What is sellable?
Yeah.
What's trending? And how do we make that trend work? Or how does this fit into our trend? And what do we need to tweak? Or, you talk about editors. That's their whole job,
Hmm.
is to help people edit to make their books more marketable.
Hmm.
That's the whole point. Um, so there is quite a question surrounding why women and why these topics,
Hmm.
and is this oppression or not? And how, if it's perceived as oppression, we need to start asking the whys of that as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is just because they're women, or at least perceived as it's just because they're women, which I think is a horrible way to assess anything.
Yeah.
But there's also a really interesting history now that people are questioning things like, was the Iliad, and like, was Homer a female? You
Yeah.
know, like, or, there's these things that we've had this perception of what kind of gender this person had, but did they? Because we have so
Mhm.
many ancient writings where we don't even know who the author was.
Exactly.
And so it's interesting as we start digging into things more. I think there's a particular linguist and translator who is retranslating the ancient works of Homer,
Mhm.
and doing so in a way, and has written books now about the evidence they are finding that perhaps this stuff was not as sexist, for one, as it was perceived from the stories, and women were treated far better, but also these other perceptions of the language used seems as if it would have been from a female culture, or
Mhm.
a predominantly matriarchal culture or
Yeah.
perspective. So I think that's a really interesting thing to bring up when we're talking about women in literature.
Hmm.
Um, there's also again, I love that you bring up too that there's so many great female writers who didn't have to have pseudonyms, who have
Yeah.
really impactful work.
Hmm.
I'm not a huge Jane Austen fan because I'm not a big romance
I'm not
person.
either yet. I started Pride and Prejudice
Yeah,
and kind of gave up because it
yeah,
just wasn't for me.
yeah. But honestly, her work was pivotal for understanding female experiences during her
Hmm.
time. And
And that's an important point to make, is that um, women writers have been expected to write women's stories.
mhm,
So you wouldn't get um, something like A Princess of Mars written by a
mhm,
woman,
yeah,
because that was, way too masculine. It was about, being a He-Man going slaughtering
yeah.
six-armed Martians.
Working your
And
way up in the tribes
yeah,
and all that kind
it
of
was
stuff.
it was
Mhm,
very masculine story, and
mhm.
so that would, if that was written by a woman under a woman's name, it wouldn't have been,
Validity.
people would have gone, what the fuck.
Yeah, yeah.
um and but because it was written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, it's
Mhm,
okay. And Little Women
mhm.
is very much, I haven't read it, but
Yeah.
what I've heard of it, it's
Slice of
very
life
much
feminist.
a woman's type story dealing with women's lives, written by Louisa May Alcott.
Mhm.
Obviously not something that you would expect to see from H.G. Wells,
Yes.
you know,
Mhm.
because men wrote men's stories and women wrote women's stories.
Mhm.
But doing that, there is a need for that female perspective in literature. I
Yes.
recently read Shadows on the Hearth by Judith Merril,
Mhm.
written at a time when there were a lot of science fiction writers writing about, atomic wars,
Mhm.
but they usually took the big political picture of and detailed the war and what went on. Judith Merril took the perspective of what happens to a family
Mhm.
in this crisis when atomic bombs are dropping. She doesn't know where her husband is or if he's even alive still. And
Mhm.
how does she and her daughters and her maid get through this crisis?
Yes.
Very much a woman's perspective, but that's what makes that novel so great, is because it isn't the big He-Man battle laden
Mhm.
political perspective on the whole thing, but it's a more human, down to earth, what's happening in our house perspective, which
Mhm.
makes it a very, very different novel than any man ever would have written.
Yes, and I think that's something, a really great perspective to bring up, because we do tend to have this kind of indignance in our culture now where it's like, oh, well, they only were allowed to write about women's issues. And I'm like, but those women's issues were important,
Yeah.
and they are a part of our history.
Hmm.
And understanding those issues is how we found progress. We needed those stories,
Hmm.
and we shouldn't be bashing those stories. Like, even if we have Oh, I hate to bring this up, but we read a pretty racist Lovecraft recently. Really awful perspective,
Yeah.
but that history is necessary to understand how far we've come and how much further we need to
Oh
go
yeah.
to eradicate it. We need to understand that people really felt this way. People
Hmm.
really had these awful perspectives,
Hmm.
and we need to change. And how do we change if we don't know it existed?
Exactly.
And so the importance of female writers for women's topics is great, but also having female writers who are more diverse than that is wonderful. We're starting to see tons of female writers or female identifying writers now
Hmm.
who are writing some really lovely works or really incredible works. Like
But we also need to break out of that.
mhm.
It's great to have novels like Shadows on the Hearth, but I roll my eyes every time I hear a woman saying she wants to write a children's book. It's like, write it while you're in the kitchen wearing your apron.
I
You know,
know
it's like so stereotyped that that is
mhm.
what women write, is children's
Yeah,
books.
children's books,
You know,
romance
let's
novels.
see you write a
Hmm.
blood and guts sword and sorcery story, or a real space opera. Actually, I read
Hmm.
um diving into the wreck, I believe was the title,
Hmm.
by Kristen Catherine Rush. Awesome space opera.
Hmm.
Nothing written by a woman, but if it would have had a man's name on it, I would have bought it. It didn't seem like a woman's story. So
Yeah.
here was a woman writing something that's completely on par with what all the guys are writing. And I thought, yes, do
Hmm.
something, break out of your stereotype and do something different.
Yes, and I still think there's a place for this very stereotype because it is important. Like, if women have a good voice for children and children can resonate with it, I think it's important that they continue to cater to their strength. But I also appreciate those who are stepping out of that.
Somebody does
Just
need to
need to
write books for
expand.
children, but
Yeah.
on the other hand, women aren't taken seriously as writers
Mm-hmm.
because of this thing that they're expected to just write children's stories,
Yes.
just write fairy tales, and that's, I roll my eyes every time I see another fairy tale retelling coming out from the
Mm-hmm.
fantasy publishers, and of course it's written by a woman.
And of
She's
course,
just,
it's very smut,
yeah, and
like the romance novel kind of stuff, just with a different genre.
she's just staying in her
Mhm.
place, being a woman writing a woman's book, and she's not going to be
Yes.
taken seriously as an author because she's just perpetuating the stereotype.
Yeah, and I, as a feminist, am also very at odds with that. I understand that there's a place and people will cater to their strengths, and I understand that there's a public who enjoys that.
Mhm.
And I have to keep that in mind. It's just because it's not for me doesn't mean it's not for them.
Yeah,
We deserve to have things we enjoy as humans because heaven knows, escapism is all we have left.
and
But
there are some really good books, like
yeah,
this one,
Gothic, Gothic
Gothic Canada,
Colony. Yep.
Runic. So a woman, it's a dark romance. Excellent book.
Yeah. Or like Tamsin Murin with
Mhm.
the Harrow,
Yeah,
I
Harold the Ninth.
Harrow the Ninth, Gideon the Ninth, and Nona.
Yeah,
Really great sci-fi fantasy.
yes.
Wonderfully done.
Mhm.
Female author or
Mhm.
female identified author, as far as
Yeah,
I know. Um,
but that one, that doesn't seem like a woman's book. You know what I mean?
no, yeah, and I think that's what the beauty of it is. I think that's the point.
It doesn't seem like a man's book, but it doesn't seem
Yeah.
like a woman's book. It's just a kick-ass great story.
Yes, and I think that's the point, is that because we had women who started it all, just by talking about female issues, it has brought to light historically the need to diversify and let
Mhm.
creatives be creatives and let authors be authors and
Mhm.
let them do what's in their strength and let them tell their stories, regardless of whether they're female identifying. And I think we see that. I know we have a lot of hot debate about this, but we do now see a trend where there's a lot of queer authors,
Mhm.
and it's very marketable, and we understand that there's a lot of queer specific issues going on and trans issues and those kinds of things, so seeing that representation in pop culture is important. However,
I think it's fine to have that, but
yeah,
it's gotten to a point where it seems like every new book that comes out has to have a queer character in it for the point of marketing the book. It's like
yes, and we do have
marketing
to
is
question that.
driving that, and did the author, are we promoting it just to promote it because it's
Yes.
selling, or are we promoting it because it really needs to be done?
Are we rainbow washing it? And
Yeah,
that's another question I often ask too, as history has gone on and we do hear about these situations where women felt like they had to put something under a pseudonym. When we look at that history, it causes me as a feminist to question the whys now. The whys then are important, but the whys now are just as important as well. Like,
yeah.
are we promoting this just for the sake of commerce and capitalism? Is that ethically and morally correct of us to do?
Well, it's going to happen because we're
It's gonna happen.
capitalists.
Yeah, we're capitalists. Yeah, or we're consumer
The
based.
publishers are not going to sit there and say, we're not going to do that because we would make money off of that. So we can't do that.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
not going to happen.
Yes, and we do have to understand that culture will have trends and they
Mhm.
will ebb and flow depending on what's going on politically, socially, all kinds of different factors. But one of the things I do have to recognize is that we definitely have a lot of women and women identifying people who are authors now. And there's a lot of incredible work from back in the day when women were suspected not to be able to have as much freedom. And there's a lot of incredible work now. And we can't ignore that.
Mhm.
And we have to see that, yes, there are still women's issues, but we have come a long way. And yet, yes, we have a long way to go. But a win is a win. And we need to be willing to celebrate those things and celebrate the
Yeah,
diversity that we see women authors writing or authors in general and just starting to see them as people
yeah.
and not see them as somebody who has a vagina
Mhm.
or, identifies as a female or whatever, being inclusive. And so,
But I think the important point to make is that when it comes to books, when it comes to literature,
mhm,
um, there have been lots of great women writers.
yes.
It's not like in the history of painting,
Hmm.
you think back before 1940 and try to think of women painters,
Yeah.
and you come up with maybe three
Hmm.
that are in the art
Yes.
that are prominent in the art history books. That's not the case with literature. With
Hmm.
literature, you've got a lot of great writing that's gone on, and it has been acknowledged as great writing, even
Yes.
if it is tending to be like Little Women aimed
Yeah.
towards a
These slice
female
of life
audience.
female audience issue. Hmm.
It still is acknowledged as great literature,
Yes.
and
It's
we
important.
don't have any lack of that.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
even in science fiction, there have been a lot of excellent writers. Maybe they didn't get as much attention as Asimov, Clark, and Heinlein, but
Hmm.
they did write and they did great work,
Hmm.
and they are, at least here, still remembered.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of people are tending to forget about classic science fiction in general because they think it's all antiquated. And I'm sitting down and rereading this stuff and saying, I don't know why you people don't love this stuff.
Hmm.
Why is Shadows on the Hearth not in print and being touted as one of the important early science fiction works,
Hmm.
especially from a feminist perspective?
Yes.
you know it just blows my mind that people are just not embracing that,
Hmm.
and it's unfortunate for those genre writers that they're being forgotten.
Hmm.
But that seems to be the way with the science fiction genre. 10 years after their death, we forget
Hmm.
all about them,
Yeah.
and their books aren't in print, and you say,
Maybe
you
several
mention
decades
their name,
later
and
they make a resurgence or
yeah,
something
you
weird
mention
like
their
that.
name and people say, who?
Yeah.
Yeah, and when they do make a resurgence, it's this big deal. Everybody's loving it, and you're sitting there going, "Yeah, I read that stuff back in the '70s. I know it's great.
Yeah.
I
It's like,
don't know
why are
why
you
you
only.
people are only figuring this out."
Yes, I know. And I think there is that. I find it in myself. I have a lot of self-righteousness about like, oh, I thought I found it first. Like I knew it ages ago, and like I kind of felt that way about Garth Nix when I read Garth Nix in elementary school, and suddenly he's super popular right
Mhm.
now. Sorry to
He's
mention a
super.
female. Yeah.
He's super popular. He makes the bestseller list. He's selling a lot of books. He's doing great, but people on BookTube aren't talking about him.
I know.
It's like,
But
what the
it's
heck?
yeah, and it's one of those things too where it's like you know, it's the trends. Things ebb and flow and whatever.
He's a major fantasy writer, and
Hmm.
the numbers of his sales point out, okay, maybe he's not as big as Sanderson, but he's still big in fantasy, and nobody on BookTube does videos about him.
Well, anyway,
Which
that's why
which
we're here.
yeah, but it only
Mhm.
it does point out that writers don't need BookTube
No,
to be successful.
no, they don't. And
He's done it without all of you.
hmm and quite honestly, too, we start thinking about a lot of classic literature written by women. Jane Austen is hugely popular,
Hmm.
hugely popular
Hmm.
for the romances. And the Bronte sisters, hugely popular for a lot, well, mostly Emily and Charlotte. And
Yeah, she didn't do much.
she didn't do much. And then she died
Yeah,
very young.
and
So,
same with their brother, um, Bramwell.
yeah.
He
So, I mean,
kind of screwed things up and screwed his life up, screwed their lives up,
and
and
then
then
died.
died.
Yep, because everybody just dies. But yeah, I think too, we can't. I think that's the overarching thing. I think, especially as modern feminists, we tend to get overly critical of the way things were and don't celebrate the way things are and don't continue to celebrate it in such a way that we make more progress.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's a common problem because humans are messy and, you know, we do start to get nitpicky about how we phrase things and how things are done and how things work and is this really considered a feminist work or not, or is this really considered good or good for women to read? What does this, you know, how does this affect the psyche? All these other questions, and I think those are all great questions to ask, but I also think it is possible to just enjoy things and not be influenced by them,
Yeah.
which can be good and can be dangerous.
Hmm.
Like some things are meant to influence in a positive direction and people don't take it that way.
Yeah.
Um, but it is what it is. And we have a lot of wonderful female authors
Hmm.
or female identifying authors who have written some great works. So,
Yeah.
next I want to ask, do you have any favorite female authors that you can think of or anybody you'd like to read more of?
Um, I've been reading him. Probably the one I want to read more of because I haven't read much by is Le Guin.
Mhm.
And
She's
recently
one of my
reading A
faves.
Wizard of Earthsea, I had read things like Lathe of Heaven and some of her
Mhm.
short stories in the past. There's a lot of her work I haven't read. Left Hand of Darkness, The Dispossessed,
Mhm.
uh, the rest of the Earthsea series, and I
Mhm.
want to get into those more and read them.
Yes, I really enjoy her work. I'd say she's probably one of my favorite female authors, as well as I love Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre is one of my favorite books.
Hmm.
I really enjoy it because it's dark and real life and messy humans and a really interesting Victorian Gothic
We
slice
got to
of
do
life
that
book.
video because I thought
Oh
Wuthering
my
Heights was
god.
better.
Really?
Yes.
I don't.
We got to duke that out sometime on camera.
Yeah, we do. That'll be a great video.
I
Next
mean, they're both,
to the topics
I
list.
mean, Jean Eyre was great, but
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anyway, we'll save it for the next video. I have a lot of commentary about that.
okay.
But yes, her sister has some great work too, and has written some nice stuff and things that are extremely popular and extremely important to literature and gothic romances. And
Outside the genre, I want to read Virginia Woolf. I've never read anything
I've
by
never
her.
read anything either. And how the fuck haven't I?
I hear a lot of great things about it.
Yes. And Anais Nin.
I've read some of hers.
I haven't read some of her stuff, but like I want to.
Okay.
Because I'm interested to see what that's about.
Hmm.
And then I have another book that I want to read, not written by, but about the first trans woman, Lily. Uh,
Okay.
so I there's a book about that. I don't think it's written by a female, but like that's a story I think that is important and part of women's history, and trans history. So I mean, there's so many good authors who are
There
female.
are.
Tamsin
There
Muir
really
and
are.
blew me away.
Hmm.
Blew me away.
And the state of things today is that the majority of readers and possibly a majority of authors are women.
Hmm.
And I think the majority of I think there may be a majority of authors being female because of the fact that the vast majority of readers, the vast majority of book consumers right now are women.
And I think there's actually, statistically speaking, more females in the world in general, census wise, than there are males. Which makes sense.
Hmm.
But also like I have a lot of feelings about that because why don't we have more power? More equality, so to speak. What does that mean? What does that look like? Lots of questions. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, women in writing is a great topic. We could probably talk more, but I don't want this video to get too long, so I'm gonna cut it off here. But
Okay.
it is an excellent topic that I think we will probably talk about more again. You have heard us also speak to a lot of female characters in books that are written by both men and women who are still
Hmm.
really great, strong female characters, especially in science fiction, which traditionally have been um, assumed to not have very good female
Yeah, I'm
characters.
finding that. Well, I mean, characters in general were not what people expect today, because
Mhm.
people today read books for characters. They want characters that are going to be their best friends.
Mhm. Someone to
That's
emotionally
not
attach to.
what people were writing in astounding science fiction in 1941.
Hmm.
Everybody back then was more interested in the scientific idea and could really, the characters were just there as witnesses to
Hmm.
cool science going on.
Yeah, and usually they were the scientists,
Yeah.
which gave them a lot of authority to have a lot of commentary.
Hmm.
So it is interesting to talk about women who write literature as much as it is for women in the literature.
Yeah.
um,
But
but yeah.
like I say, you get to the 1950s and you got authors like Judith Merril that were writing, you know, all strong women
Hmm.
characters, stuff that would stand up, that would hold up today and
Hmm.
under today's scrutiny.
Yeah,
Um, it's
it's all
it's
important.
more in the specific examples that you go to looking
Hmm.
for it. I think people aren't reading the right books.
Hmm.
Shadows on the Hearth, you can pick up a first edition copy
Yeah.
in great condition for like $15 because
Hmm.
it's just not known anymore.
Yeah. And I think that is something maybe that Telltale it's something we are trying to change as a business. Telltale is trying to change that. There's just good literature out there, no matter who it's written by, that is so underwhelmed and needs to be a bigger deal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's our goal. And we're gonna keep talking about things and topics like this. And again, I don't want us to get too long and
Okay.
I'm gonna cut things off here while it's still topical. But yeah, so talk to us. Tell us what are some of your favorite female authors, or female characters, because that might be another topic we should do a lot more on and get more in depth about. Even though
Sure.
we sprinkle it in a lot of our videos, I think
Mm-hmm.
that'd be another great topic.
Mm-hmm.
But comment, tell us what you think, like, subscribe, join us again for more topics like this, as well as some of the many wonderful authors we have mentioned here. We are working through a bunch of their works, and haven't started some of them, but some of them we really want to start, like Virginia Woolf and
Yeah.
Anais Nin. Those ones we've wanted to do a lot more with. So thanks for joining us, guys. Like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.